the Fifth Estate.
Good evening. I'm Eric Malling. 9 Canadians who were the unwitting victims of CIA brainwashing experiments are suing the United States.
Hi everybody, my name's James. Welcome to California High Desert Preacher. Today's video is going to be discussing
government. But so far, the Canadian government has done nothing to help them.
If I were in charge of a government to whom 9 citizens that we are suing for have been brainwashed without their knowing, have had their lives impaired, and have it done by a foreign agency, undercover without the government of Canada knowing it, I would find a way to help those people instead of hindering them.
4 years ago, there were some startling revelations about the activities of the CIA in Canada. The American Intelligence Agency had paid for a series of brainwashing experiments under a project codenamed MKULTRA. The tests were conducted in secret in the United States and in Canada at a mental hospital attached to McGill University. Experimental drugs, including LSD, were administered to human guinea pigs. The patients were never told that their treatment was part of a CIA experiment. 9 Canadians are now suing the U.S. government for $1 million apiece. They charge that their lives were disrupted forever as a result of the brainwashing. Despite the fact that the CIA operated secretly in Canada to fund these medical experiments on Canadian citizens, the federal government in Ottawa has joined hands with the government in Washington to hold back vital information which might at last reveal all the sordid details.
In Winnipeg, Val Orlico spends a lot of time tending her plants. It's one of the few hobbies she has left. She used to devour books and write long letters. Now she can't concentrate on a book for more than a single page, and writing a letter is beyond her. She's on medication 24 hours a day. If she wasn't married to David Orlico, an NDP member of Parliament, she might never have learned the full story of what happened to her.
That's very good. I better get out the tomatoes and the green pepper and...
In 1956, suffering from depression after childbirth, Mrs. Orlico was referred by her Winnipeg doctor to a top psychiatrist in Montreal. Unknowingly, she was about to become part of a cruel CIA experiment, codenamed MKUltra. In Langley, Virginia, outside of Washington, stands the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, protected by walls of secrecy as high as the trees. Stored inside computers like this one is what's left of the CIA files on the MKUltra project. Convinced the Soviets and Chinese had perfected brainwashing during the Korean War, the agency sought to perfect its own techniques, both to protect its agents and to use as a weapon.
Who did you meet with in the safe house?
The CIA man overseeing the project was John Gittinger.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
In Montreal, on the side of the mountain overlooking the city, stands an ancestral home bearing a name worthy of an Edgar Allan Poe horror tale, Ravenscraig. Donated to McGill, Ravenscraig became the Allen Memorial Institute for the Treatment of Mental Illness. Here the CIA channeled money for MKUltra, Sub-Project 68, which became a real-life horror tale. The project chief in Montreal was Dr. Ewan Cameron, world-renowned chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at McGill and director of the Allen Memorial Institute.
The CIA secretly funded the medical experiments through a front in New York City called, of all things, the Society for the Protection of Human Ecology. Documents show that the agency had been impressed with earlier work done at McGill in sensory deprivation, work that was useful in designing sophisticated torture techniques later on. But at the time, brainwashing looked even more promising, and Dr. Cameron was the perfect one to carry out the work. An American citizen with a world-class reputation, operating outside of the United States.
Dr. Cameron certainly had the credentials. At various times, president of the Canadian, the American, and even the World Psychiatric Association.
These are the days and hours are the occasions.
In an address to colleagues from around the world, Cameron showed that he certainly knew the potential of the human mind, for good and bad.
And it is his mind, no less, which may destroy mankind.
Val Orlico came to the Allen for her postpartum depression.
Everybody in the hospital was very much in awe of Dr. Cameron, and he strode the halls like a giant. And people would say, oh, there but for God goes God. And to me, I thought, how could he possibly ever take me for a patient? Who am I? I mean, this great man who's done all these marvelous things. And boy, I better work hard, and I better do everything that he tells me to do. And, you know, I don't want to lose this opportunity to get well.
Like Mrs. Orlico, Mrs. Janine Huard of Montreal came to Dr. Cameron depressed after childbirth. The depression was made worse by a hearing problem that coincided with the birth of her child. She, too, was in awe of Dr. Cameron.
He was a very, very impressive man. And I was told he was the best doctor in North America. So he would look at you a few minutes, ask you a few questions, and then proceed with the treatments.
But I never saw him once in all the times that I saw him that I wasn't afraid. Every time I went down to his office, I would shake with fear. And every time I'd see him coming down the hall, I'd shake with fear. But I adored him.
Dr. Elliot Emanuel knew Cameron.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
At Ravenscraig, Dr. Cameron went further with drugs and electric shock treatments than any of the U.S. researchers in the MKULTRA project dared. His aim was to wipe the mind clean. Then he would implant new messages by forcing the patient to listen to a hypnotic repetition as many as 250,000 times. This was called psychic driving. Most of the drugs used in the program were experimental, and some dangerous. There was the tranquilizer Artane, a paralysis-inducing anectine, and curare, which pygmies tipped their arrows with to paralyze victims. Bulbocapnine, another experimental tranquilizer, and lysergic acid diethylmide, the hallucinogen LSD. In her room at Ravenscraig, Mrs. Orlico waited for her first treatment.
Well, I saw a tray with hypodermic, with a needle, a syringe, and the card on it had my name, so I looked a little more closely, and it was lysergic acid diethylamide. And my husband was a druggist, and I knew a lot of drugs, but I'd never heard of that one. And so I phoned a friend, and who was a psychiatric nurse, and I said, do you know what it is? And she said, I never heard of it. But she had a friend who was a psychiatrist, so she phoned her friend, and she called me back, and she said, he said that this stuff causes poisonous psychosis. She said he said not to take it. Well, I thought, you know, he's a very Freudian psychiatrist and doesn't believe in any medication of any kind. And after all, here's Dr. Cameron. I mean, he's the big doctor, and he's, you know, he's known all over the world, and he wouldn't do anything that would harm me, etc. And so I took the injection, but I didn't like it. And it really did create a poisonous psychosis.
LSD, with all its frightening mental images, was scarcely known at the time. But the CIA secretly brought some in from Switzerland, where it had just been developed.
The room became very distorted, and I thought my bones were all melting. And I just wanted to scream that I wanted to get out of there. And I saw the squirrels outside, and I thought, they're not the squirrels, I'm the squirrel. I'm in this cage, and I can't get out. And I started to throw myself from side to side in the room. And I couldn't write. They had given me a pencil and paper and asked me to write down, but I couldn't write. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't focus. I don't know. It was like some kind of funny hell I'd fallen into, and I couldn't get out. And I don't know how long that went on. It was just a terrible nightmare. And I just felt that my life was threatened. I could never go back to what I'd been.
Robert Logie of Vancouver was 18 when he came to the Allen complaining of trembling and severe leg pains, diagnosed as psychosomatic. Like Mrs. Orlico and Mrs. Huard, he had no inkling he was to be part of a CIA experiment.
The LSD was very horrifying, and they gave it to me for about 12 or 15 times. One minute I would see the doctor there, the next minute I wouldn't see him there, and they were asking me all kinds of questions, and I remember them telling me that I was getting smaller and smaller, and I really felt myself getting smaller. And they were bringing me back in time, way back, you know. At one point I almost felt like I was just about to be born, really, that far back in memory, and they were really probing, asking all kinds of questions, and I felt I didn't have any control. I had to answer. I didn't feel I had any control. I was completely, like they had complete control over me.
Mrs. Huard, like the others, was forced to pay for the so-called treatment, massive electric shocks, and all the drugs.
They would give me as much as 40 pills a day. And I would ask the nurse, what is that? They would say it's a new drug, and they only name it by a number.
What did all those drugs do to you? How did they make
you feel?
Well,
I was very, very strong, well-powered. So these drugs kind of desensitize me. They would lower my reactions. They would lower my resistance.
As well as the experimental drugs and massive electric shock treatments, Mrs. Huard was subjected to psychic driving. Hypnotic-like messages were repeated over and over to a sleeping patient, sometimes for as long as 16 hours in a row. They were a key part of the mind control experiment. This is how Mrs. Huard remembers one of the messages.
Why are you running away from your responsibilities, Janine? Why, Janine? Why? Janine, why are you running away from your responsibilities? Why are you running away from your responsibilities, Janine? Why are you running away? Why are you running away from your responsibilities? Why are you running away?
I would try very strongly not to let my mind be capturing all the messages, but they would lower my resistance so much with the heavy drugs, but I couldn't do otherwise than listen.
Did you ever ask them how any of this was making you better?
No, I didn't ask questions. I was just say, I don't want to go through it again. And I would cry. I didn't want it, you know. I knew it. Way down in my heart, I knew it wasn't good. But, you know, how could you fight? You're in a hospital where it's supposed to be the best, with the best doctors. So, what can you do?
I'd say, I can't take it anymore. I can't stand it. I don't think this is doing me any good. I feel worse. And he'd walk down the hall a little way with me and put his arm on my shoulder. And come on now, lassie, you know you're going to do it. And finally I'd say, well, okay. And off we'd go to my room, and he would give me another injection and then pat me on the shoulder, and off he'd be again. I had LSD, I believe, a total of 14 times. And sometimes there would be 4 days between the injections, and sometimes there would be one consecutive day after the other. And some of them I managed to write down things in my notes to Dr. Cameron.
A newly declassified CIA document shows there was at least one voice of protest at the agency as the experiments got underway. One agent wrote, "Does Project Officer approve these immoral and inhuman tests? I suggest that all who are in favor of the above intended operation volunteer their heads for use in Dr. So-and-so's noble project." The names were deleted. In her hospital room, a terrified Mrs. Orlico tried to hide like a child at the sound of Dr. Cameron's approaching footsteps.
I heard him coming, and I hid in the washroom in my room. And I thought, well, I'll go and sit on the toilet and nobody will see me. Anyhow, that didn't work because he knocked on the door and he said, "Now, come on, Lassie, you know you're in there, and come on, you come out and let me give you your injection." And I said, "No, I'm not taking any more injections. I can't do it. I don't care if I die. I can't do it anymore because this is killing me, and that's all there is to it. I can't do it." Well, he wasn't very happy about it. And however, after a little discussion, he turned on his heel and left the room.
The electric shock treatments were administered on an unprecedented scale. It was called de-patterning. The mind was short-circuited so the psychic driving hypnotic messages could be planted on a clean slate. There is now no known use of electric shocks on such a scale, even in Soviet mental asylums where political crimes are punished. Psychiatrist and former colleague of Dr. Cameron, Dr. Elliot Emanuel.
As you probably know, electroshock treatment has been given for depression for something like 40 years now. It's a very successful and useful treatment for severe depression that doesn't respond to other things. But de-patterning is a use of electroshock treatment in a totally different way, in which instead of giving the shocks, say, 2 or 3 times a week, they're given 2 or 3 times a day for 3 or 4 weeks, reducing the patient to a sort of animal, vegetable state, from which it's hoped that they would recover in a